If I had to guess before ever watching the Red Pill movie, I would have assumed that Michael Kimmel would be the most malignantly disingenuous feminist interviewed. And as reliably dishonest as he was, he didn't really outshine any of his peers. Compared to the rest of the Red Pill movie interviews, he was just another cookie in the same cutter, diligently making the need for a non-feminist men's movement all the more obvious. Michael Messner, a relative unknown to men's movement circles, made a very strong showing of his own right. He was quite becoming of the sniffing pseudo-intellectual pageantry that feminists present to the world in lieu of knowledge. And that was before I looked at the extended footage Cassie Jaye released in the raw files. In the original movie, Messner came across as the archetypal haughty academic, dripping disdain for the great unwashed masses of the unenlightened. He was openly contemptuous of men, particularly of men who labored as an act of love for their families, blind to the reality that their duties, not their choices, take their time away from the home. That may be hard for him to understand from the insulated, air-conditioned confines of his university office. Though less vocal about it, he seemed equally contemptuous of women, too, who lived traditional lives with breadwinning husbands. If you want to see my first review of Messner, taken directly from the Red Pill movie, I've linked it in the low bar. Moving on to the raw files version, I must admit that I was a little disappointed at the expanded footage, in which Messner has apparently been questioned about the origins of the men's movement. That's not a criticism of Jaye. I assume she saw that line of questioning as obligatory, and to some degree I suppose it was, if only to demonstrate, one feminist after another, their abject ignorance of the subject. If you'll permit me a slight digression here, I should say that the Cassie Jaye of 2013 and 2014 has my deepest sympathies. I mean, really. Can you imagine being a feminist, digging into the men's rights movement, getting challenged and more than a little rattled by what you're uncovering, then heading into the feminist camp looking for a way to prop up your faltering views? Only to have feminists open their mouths and prove correct everything MRAs are saying about them. And that is the one thing that this movie did that was long overdue. It shows the world in no uncertain terms just how uninformed feminists are. Uninformed about men, uninformed about men's issues, and particularly, willfully uninformed about the men's movement. Hell, they're even uninformed about feminism, but that's a different talk for another day. For now, it's time to move on with this rebuttal because understanding how and why Messner was so wrong is critical in understanding the true narrative of our shared history. In so many other areas, like domestic violence, patriarchy theory, and the lie of rape culture, we have finally loosened the feminist stranglehold on the conversation. It is also critically important to correct the feminist false narrative of the origins of our movement. And we start that with words from a feminist who touts himself as an authority on the subject.
The men's rights movement is a spectrum like any others, and I think there are, and the way I look at the development of the men's rights movement is they came out of the men's liberation movement of the 1970s.
There now. It took exactly 14 seconds for Messner to utter the first of many falsehoods. It's popular among feminists to believe that the men's movement was born of a reaction to the rise of gender feminism of the late 60s and early 70s. Catherine Spiller also said as much in her interview, reflecting the same codified ignorance. There was actually a deepening awareness of the issues and an emergent movement for men going back nearly 100 years before Betty Friedan ever sat around on her husband's money writing The Feminine Mystique. In a Voice for Men article by men's movement historian Robert St. Estephe titled Setting the Record Straight on the Men's Rights Movement, provides a detailed 14,000-word treatise on everything that Michael Messner and the entire cadre of supposed gender scholars never knew and never will. He begins with a couple of anecdotes from the mouths of jurists about the alimony racket circa 1925. Chicago Judge Harry A. Lewis said, and I quote, "Under our modern standards, woman is no longer man's inferior. If you would find out whether this is true, ask any one of them and see what she says in reply. Yet there appear before me every day unobligated women who seek from $15 to $50 a week from their former husband's earnings to add to their own comfortable salaries, and for no other reason, pretext, or cause than that they were once married to the men." Unquote. Of the following year, St. Estephe writes, New York Judge Sella B. Strong offered a parallel view. "The whole business of alimony grabbing is degrading. It cheapens the relations between men and women. I truly believe alimony keeps thousands of couples from being reconciled. The woman being supported by her husband under the order of a court isn't anxious to effect a reconciliation. She is dawdling in idleness, free, irresponsible. She's making him suffer, so she gloats." St. Estephe continues, in 1925, Doris Blake, widely read syndicated newspaper columnist, devoted a column to Judge Strong's views, summing up her own view by calling alimony grifters a parasitic class. In 1928, best-selling novelist Faith Baldwin had this to say, and I quote, "The rising tide of divorce has brought us a new industry, the ultimate refinement of gold digging, the perfection of blackmail within the law, marriage for alimony. Women who do not want husbands or children have found a joker in our marriage laws by which they can establish themselves comfortably for life, free, respectable, rich, safe, without personal cost or sacrifice." In 1931, journalist Ruth Brown had the following to say, "The alimony racket has become the great woman's industry, a sobbing pretty woman before the court, and what chance there has the husband? In many cases, the amount of alimony is so large in proportion to the man's earnings that it completely nullifies any chance of happiness or of another marriage. And why, one cannot help but ask, should a divorced man be denied the right to a normal family life?" Obviously, Brown didn't take the plunge into MGTOW, recognizing a man's right to live outside the confines of marriage and family life. But hey, this was 1931, and she was still 5 years behind the times. St. Estephe informs us that the world's first men's rights organization dedicated to a comprehensive range of men's issues with a goal of legal reform was founded in 1926 in Vienna. It was aptly named the Federation for Men's Rights. Even this was not the first stab at it. In the 1890s, the first MGTOW-style and men's rights organization was formed in response to a push by the Women's Rescue League to tax men for refusing to get married and to bar bachelors from high-level public positions. Thus was born the Bachelor Band of 1898. Even this wasn't the first attempt at a bachelor tax. In 1827, a large group of men met in a New York City hotel to organize a protest against a bill before the New York legislature that replaced a current tax on dogs with one on bachelors. This was documented in an article by Peter Wright of gynocentrism.com, and I have linked that as well in the low bar, along with Robert St. Estephe's piece. The point here is that while admittedly on a very small scale, there have been organized reactions to rampant gynocentrism, which by definition is a men's movement, going back a long time. There were many ebbs and flows because, much to the dismay of ideologues like Messner and company, none of them were a reaction to feminism. The early stages of this movement were generally a reaction to societal gynocentrism in family law that has always been there. Feminists are only accurate in their assessment of the men's movement being a reaction to feminism in that it took feminism, modern society's ultimate form of gynocentrism, to motivate the more aggressive reaction we see today. This is part of what sparked the formation of the National Coalition for Men in the 1970s, and I'm proud to say that A Voice for Men is now a part of that history. Messner continues to reveal his ignorance as he tries to explain what he thinks is the emergence of a men's movement, only to get it conflated with his own agenda.
And Warren Farrell was at the center of that, of the men's liberation movement, and we're talking like early to mid 1970s. And the men's liberation movement struck attempted to strike a really nice balance between two opposing positions. And the one position is the feminist position, or the feminist observation that men hold power and privilege over women, and that women are oppressed in a patriarchal society. And the other position is that men are hurt by masculinity, or some of the things I was talking about a little early on, that that men have problems with health problems, and men have lower life expectancy, and our relationships are injured, that masculinity is really a kind of box that closes men in very unhealthy sorts of ways. And those two observations, that men have power and privilege and that there are costs of masculinity, are kind of contradictory points, and they're in this creative tension with each other. And the men's liberation movement, I think, was attempting to and a lot of it was sort of driven by therapists, people who were involved with working with men in therapy, but who were inspired by feminism at the same time. And they were trying to sort of put those two things into play with each other, and keep them into some sort of dynamic play, and organize men around the idea that equality between women and men was good for men too. Because it was going to make us more healthy and happier and better lovers and everything, So Warren Farrell was right in the middle of that. And in the late 70s, early 80s, some of the you could almost see the men's liberation movement. You've seen those pictures of an amoeba that's a single cell, and then immediately it starts to kind of pull apart and squeeze in the middle, and then it separates, and it's two separate organisms. This is sort of what happened with the men's liberation movement, is that there were these debates within the movement that some men, and this is mostly men with a few women, I guess, some men really wanted to emphasize the costs of masculinity and pull men in to create more sort of healthy conceptions of masculinity and better relationships and better fathering and all of that. And other men who are more politicized and more aligned with feminists, by the time you get to the late 70s, it becomes much more politicized in a lot of ways. Anti-pornography movement among women, so the men who are more aligned with radical feminists increasingly in the mid to late 70s felt the need to emphasize a lot more the men's power and privileges part. Let's organize politically. Let's not sort of sit around feeling sorry for ourselves because we have lower life expectancy, or because we can't cry. We were told we couldn't cry. Now let's hug each other and cry. So the radical feminist men sort of kind of started making fun of that part of men's liberation, and the attempt in the early 70s to kind of fuse those two creatively started to kind of pull apart, and you started to see this polarization of some men becoming more politically radicalized and moving into the camp of a lot of them that I've been interviewing lately, who are doing anti-violence work, anti-rape and sexual assault work and so forth, and men who had more of a therapeutic orientation and were thinking more about helping men develop more healthy and happy lives. And some of those who pulled in that direction and started to form a men's rights movement developed a really strong anti-feminist orientation to them, and not all of them. And that's one of the things I learned by doing some research on the men's rights movement, is that it's not like a lot of movements, there's different tendencies within it, but some, I think, men in that movement still retain somewhat of a feminist orientation, in the sense that they believe equality between women and men is really the ultimate goal, and that they see some ways that women are still underprivileged in society, and then that there are others on the other end of the continuum who are so angry, and I would say just misogynist.
Now, I have the opportunity to yet again briefly digress here to point out something that is one of the biggest, albeit largely unaddressed, bottles of snake oil bottled in the heart of the feminist ethos. that of men who reject masculinity as we know it in favor of a more feminine standard of being. The theory being that by easing pressure on men to be strong and by empowering women in their own personal agency, men reap the benefit of less stress and fewer burdens, perhaps fostering improved health and even longevity. The part that Messner leaves out, and quite understandably given his agenda, is that men who reject traditional masculinity also tend to find themselves rejected by women. I recall a conversation I had with Warren Farrell about his meeting a feminist woman in his early days as a feminist. There was a sexual attraction between them, and they set out for a night out, and likely the expectation of sex. Warren was certain enough of the outcome that he brought contraception. When they went to dinner, Warren assumed that the woman, as an empowered, autonomous human being, would want to pay her own way, which she did. As soon as the check was paid, she told him she had just lost interest in him sexually, making certain he knew it was about having to pay her own way. I don't know, but I expect what Farrell gathered from this was that now conventions and demanding equal rights was all well and good, but when you strip away the lofty rhetoric and the falsely empowered female bravado, the fact remained that for most women, if you want to play, you must pay. In other words, the model of masculinity that feminists like Messner are so keen on seeing other men embrace means you will probably get rejected as unmanly and sleep alone, even by women on the vanguard of the feminist movement. Now, how stressful is that? Please pardon the departure here. I just couldn't respond to Messner's lake of bilge water without pointing this out. Alas, we are talking history here, and in particular the gulf between reality and Michael Messner's version of it. Not being someone to reinvent the wheel for no apparent reason, I want to lean on an excerpt from the introduction to Peter Wright's new book, A Brief History of the Men's Movement from 1856 to Present. Of course, I placed a link to it on Amazon if you're interested. According to Wright, the term men's rights was used at least as early as February 1856, when it appeared in Putnam's magazine and again in the London Daily News on Friday, the 6th of May, 1898, which reports the birth of a men's rights movement and a men's rights league. The term men's rights movement has repeatedly appeared in print since that time. I'll go ahead and read you the extract. The MRM has been vulnerable to annexing by gender studies proponents, says Wright, who claimed the first men's movement was launched in the 1970s by second-wave feminists. For example, the current Wikipedia entry on the men's rights movement has suffered censorship of any material from the now century-long tradition of men's rights activism addressing issues such as unfair divorce law, alimony, criminal sentencing, and the like. In place of that long tradition, the opening sentence of the Wikipedia article, one enforced by Wikipedia administrative editors, reads as follows. The men's rights movement, or MRM, is a part of the larger men's movement. It branched off from the men's liberation movement in the early 1970s. Few serious scholars would accept the MRM began in the 1970s, Wright continues, there being numerous examples of well-organized men's rights activism extending back to the 1800s. Moreover, the men's liberation movement cited in the Wikipedia article was in fact a feminist initiative launched to foster more pro-feminist ideology among men, with the latter movement arising within the National Organization for Women. The longevity of the MRM has been largely overlooked due to successful efforts to censor its existence. Such censorship is not new, being also described more than 100 years ago by men's rights activist Ernest B. Bax, who wrote about efforts to block the circulation of his pamphlet on the legal disadvantages and discrimination suffered by men. Bax referred to censorship from the influential feminist sisterhood as being well known among publishers. And he goes on to quote Bax directly here. Feminists say the pamphlet, The Legal Subjection of Men, in which the present state of the law and its administration between the sexes is given, should be suppressed, and also in the representations made to the editor from a women's committee of the body that I should be muzzled, and any statement of mine averse to feminism be excluded from the party organs. Reference, Women's Privileges and Rights, Social Democrat, Volume 13, Number 9, September 1909. The apostles of feminism, said Bax, being unable to make a plausible case out in reply, with one consent resort to the boycott, and by ignoring what they cannot answer, seek to stop the spread of the unpleasant truth so dangerous to their cause. The pressure put upon publishers and editors by the influential feminist sisterhood is well known. Reference, The Fraud of Feminism, 1913. As with the examples provided by Bax, the effort to censure men's voices has continued through all three waves of feminism, as witnessed with the release of the contemporary MRM documentary, The Red Pill, for example, which saw groups of feminists threaten to harass venues worldwide that had agreed to screen the documentary, venues which later reneged as a result of the intimidation. For the purpose of fighting for free speech, there's always existed a strand within the MRM that pushes back against examples of feminist censorship. Aside from that pushback, attacking feminism has never been the main goal of the movement, despite claims by some that the MRM is nothing but an anti-feminist backlash. A brief survey of the last 100 years reveals that the MRM is concerned more directly with issues impacting men and boys, such as alimony, genital mutilation of male infants, male homelessness, mental illness, false accusations, family court bias, suicide, child custody, low funding for male health issues, educational performance, and misandry in mainstream culture, just to name a few. Good stuff there by Peter Wright as usual. I highly recommend reading it if you aren't satisfied with Messner's historical fiction. Oh, and the Wikipedia article that Wright criticized relies exclusively on Messner's false claims about the beginning of the MRM from his 1998 paper, The Limits of the Male Sex Role, an analysis of the men's liberation and men's rights movement's discourse, gender and society. Down the rabbit hole we go. Now, I would bear in mind that although we're talking of a single historical MRM, it is more accurately defined as an aggregate of separate MRM initiatives, exactly as is the case with feminism. But an even more important point here is the faulty feminist thinking that leads people like Messner to imagine erroneously that the history of the men's movement begins with second-wave feminism. To be clear, men of the feminist second wave did have a movement. It was called feminism. It wasn't in any way that can be taken seriously a men's movement, for no other reason than the fact it was predicated entirely on women's issues. How, one must wonder, do you have a movement for men that is based on advocacy for women? It's like saying that African Americans would benefit from a movement whose aim is to address injustices against Hispanics, Asians, or even whites for that matter. But that is precisely what happened, and it has led us to a culture of feminist men who are literally clueless about the issues that face their own group. Indeed, they work actively to suppress the discussion of those issues right alongside feminist women. Men's movement? No, it was just more gender feminism. As for how it might benefit men, I'll leave you to ask Warren Farrell about getting rejected because he was not financially chivalrous with a feminist woman. Some men's movement, eh? The men's movement, the actual men's movement, has a long and mostly buried history that we are just beginning to uncover. And it is on any kind of honest examination of movement that has focused heavily on resisting gynocentrism, even from the days long before that word was in common use. Anyone who tells you that it started with second-wave feminism is uneducated on the subject and grossly so. even those alleged gender experts whose academic careers are based on the lies. Understanding our history is very, very important to understanding our future. Up to now, that history has been stolen and revised by people like Michael Messner. The good news is that at least until Google decides to delist the real history of the men's rights movement, we have a magnificent tool in the internet to set the record straight on men's rights. And that is it for this talk. As always, I hope you've enjoyed, and we'll see you next time.